In this video, Magnus Carlsen shocks the current world champion Ding Liren with the King's Gambit opening after the moves e4, e5, and then f4, the key move of the King's Gambit. Now, the King's Gambit is the most aggressive opening in chess, and here Magnus Carlsen's idea in this chess.com blitz game against Ding Liren is very simple. With the King's Gambit, he is giving up that pawn on the f4 square. Here, Ding Liren takes the pawn, and now Magnus Carlsen is literally down a pawn on move 2. However, Magnus does have decent compensation for the missing pawn, thanks to his extra pawn in the center of the board. Obviously, Magnus has two central pawns versus the one of Ding Liren. Now, here in the game, Magnus goes knight to f3. This is the main line of the King's Gambit opening, and here Ding Liren has a wide variety of moves he could play. For example, d6 and g5 are very strong and very popular, but instead here Ding Liren, he goes for a modern idea. That is the move knight to f6, and this is known as the Schallopp's defense, and it has emerged recently as one of Black's strongest and most reliable antidotes to the King's Gambit. Now, what is the idea? First of all, Ding Liren is attacking that pawn on e4 of Magnus Carlsen. If Magnus defends with, say, d3 or knight to c3, then Ding Liren is going to strike in the center with the move d5, and he's going to have a very, very easy game. So here, Magnus Carlsen, the only way he can try to justify the fact that he's down a full pawn in this King's Gambit opening is to push the pawn to the e5 square, and that is what Magnus does. But here, Ding Liren, he came prepared. In the game, he goes knight to h5, by far the strongest move and the entire idea of the Schallopp's defense with the move knight to f6. Now, what is the idea behind Ding Liren's knight jump, knight to h5? Well, it's very simple. Here on h5, the knight is very active. Very importantly, it defends the pawn on f4, that being the key King's Gambit pawn, and White's going to have a very difficult time regaining the pawn. And beyond that, if Ding Liren goes g5 in the future, and if Magnus tries to go h4, that won't work as the knight has access to the g3 square. So Ding Liren's knight on h5 in this King's Gambit opening, despite being stuck on the edge of the board, it is a very strong piece in this position. Now here Magnus, he has a wide variety of moves in this King's Gambit opening. He can go, for example, d4, knight to c3, bishop e2, and so on. But instead here, he goes queen to e2. A very interesting idea, lining up the queen with the black king on the e8 square. However, if Ding manages to castle, for example, bishop e7, then short castles, he can get his rook onto e8 very fast, and that would oppose the white queen on e2, giving Magnus Carlsen all sorts of problems in this game. And that is what Ding Liren does. He goes bishop e7, intending a very fast castle and perhaps rook to e8, again lining up the rook with the white queen on the e2 square. Now here, Magnus, d4, the main idea of the King's Gambit, of course, is trying to get those powerful central pawns on d4 and e5, and now Ding, he just castles. And now Magnus, what is his plan in this King's Gambit middle game? Well, obviously, short castling is going to be very hard to achieve. Here, the queen on e2 is obviously blocking in the bishop on the f1 square. Therefore, long castling will be the most logical plan, and that is what Magnus tries to go for here. He starts knight to c3, trying to develop his queenside pieces. Perhaps he wants to go bishop d2 and then long castles. And here, Ding Liren, he finds a very powerful idea. He starts d6, trying to challenge Magnus Carlsen's very powerful pawn on e5 in this King's Gambit opening. And from there, he's going to have to develop his queenside pieces, but Ding has a very strong idea in mind for this game. All right, now Magnus, bishop d2. Obviously, the pawn on f4 being defended by the knight, you can't take that, you can't go to e3, and fianchettoing the bishop on b2 would not be a very strong idea here. So, bishop d2, by far the best move. And now Ding Liren, he finds the best way to organize his pieces in this crazy King's Gambit middle game. Here, he goes bishop g4 with the bishop, activating the bishop, and the idea is he wants to follow up with the move knight to d7. So a very powerful setup for Black in this position. Now Magnus castles long castles on the board, and again, Ding Liren, knight to d7. Very, very strong idea. Instead, if he went knight to c6, that knight would be vulnerable in the center. For example, Magnus could go d5 at some point, and the knight would be a little bit further away from the defense of the king's side. However, here, after knight to d7, the knight can always go to f8 or f6 in the future, helping out with the defense of the black king. So knight d7, fantastic move by Ding Liren, the world champion. Now, real fast, if you're enjoying this video, please smash the YouTube like button. Thank you so much. Now, back to the video. Now here, Magnus Carlsen, he has a wide variety of ideas that he could play in this King's Gambit middle game on move 10. For example, knight to e4, taking on d6, king b1, these are all playable. Instead here, he finds a very creative idea, queen to e1. Now, Magnus Carlsen's idea is he wants to get the queen out of that pin from the bishop on g4. When the queen was on e2, of course, the bishop was pinning the knight to the queen, And now he's stepping out of that, and he's also setting up ideas like bishop d3 or bishop c4, trying to develop the light-squared bishop. Now here, Ding Liren, the best move for him is going to be rook to e8, as we talked about earlier, lining up the black rook with the white queen on the e-file. However, instead here, he goes for a slightly weaker idea in time pressure. He goes c6. The idea of this move potentially is to guard the d5 square. However, knight d5 was not a threat for Magnus in this position, so this may have been a wasted move. Now here, Magnus, he continues his idea. Bishop b2, and now the knight on f3 is finally out of that pin of the bishop on the g4 square. Now Ding, rook to e8, very logical move, again lining up the rook with the white queen on the e1 square in this King's Gambit opening. And here, Magnus goes for a break on the king side. He finally plays his key idea, that is g3. Now the idea behind this move, it is a pawn sacrifice. If black takes on g3, as Ding Liren could do in the game if he wanted to, Magnus Carlsen would be giving up on winning back that pawn on f4 forever. However, in return, he would get two open files on the king side, that being the f file and the h file for his major pieces, the rooks and the queens, and that would be very, very dangerous for Ding. So instead, he does not take on g3. Instead, he takes on e5. D takes e5 on the board. Now, this was slightly inaccurate. The computer likes the idea of c5 here, trying to blow open the center immediately. Instead, d takes e5 on the board. And here, Magnus, the best idea is d takes e5, but instead he jumps in with the knight. Knight takes e5. Now, this move looks more active, but the key problem is the knight gives up control of that f3 square. When the knight was back on f3, it was blockading that square. But now, after knight takes e5, that pawn is vacated, and we're going to see how Ding Liren capitalizes on that in this King's Gambit opening. Here, Ding, he takes on e5, knight takes e5, Magnus takes back, and then Ding Liren finds the key idea in this King's Gambit opening, f3, pushing the pawn down the board. Now this pawn is pressuring the bishop on e2, and beyond that, Ding Liren may threaten f2 at some point with the double attack on the queen on the e1 square and the bishop hitting the rook if the bishop moves. So now here, Magnus Carlsen already is in a world of trouble. All right, what should he be doing here? In the game, he goes bishop d3, trying to find an active square for the bishop in this King's Gambit opening. However, this was already very inaccurate. Instead, c4 was the best square for the bishop, and here's why. If Magnus went bishop c4, this does two things. First of all, it increases the pressure with the rook on d1 hitting the black queen on d8. For example, weird ideas like bishop to g5 or bishop h6 are technically possible with the discovered attack of the rook on the queen. However, beyond that, on c4, the bishop also pressures the weak f7 point in black's position, and that is going to be very, very important if Magnus follows up with the move rook h to f1 at some point in the future. However, instead, after bishop d3, the bishop is less active, the rook on d1 is less active, and here Ding Liren, the world champion, he starts to take over and really dominate this King's Gambit game. All right, here, Ding Liren, he jumps in with the queen d4 on the board, very active idea. Now Magnus finds the best idea, queen to e4, trying to force off the queens. However, Ding Liren saw this, and he knows even if the queens come off the board, his pressure does not stop thanks to this very powerful pawn on the f3 square. Here, Ding takes on e4, queen takes e4, Magnus takes back, and now here in this King's Gambit opening, Ding Liren finds the key idea versus Magnus Carlsen. He goes f2, and now this bishop is lining up with the rook on d1, and beyond that, Ding Liren is going to have various threats after the follow-up idea, bishop c5, as we're going to see in the game. Now here, Magnus, what should he be doing? Obviously, if you take on f2, Ding Liren just takes on d1, he's going to be up the exchange, and that is effectively game over. So, knight takes f2, technically a good move, but not a very good practical one. Instead here, Magnus goes rook d to f1, trying to blockade that pawn on the f2 square. However, here, Ding Liren, the key move is bishop to f3, threatening the rook on h1, and look at this, Magnus Carlsen's rook in this crazy King's Gambit middle game endgame, it is trapped on the h1 square. Obviously, if it goes to g1, then f takes g1 is the move. So no matter what Magnus Carlsen does, he is going to be losing the exchange here. Now, instead of going down passively, he goes for a fighting move, g4, expanding on the king side, and threatening the knight on h5. This is a very good practical decision by Magnus Carlsen in this King's Gambit opening. But here, Ding Liren, he finds the move bishop to h4, a very strong idea, simply ignoring the threat of the pawn on the knight on the h5 square. And here, Magnus takes the knight in this King's Gambit opening, g takes h5, and what the heck was Ding Liren's idea, giving up the knight? Well, this is it. First, Ding Liren takes that free pawn on the e5 square, rook takes e5, activating the rook and putting pressure on the knight on the e4 square. Now, Magnus, what should he be doing? Obviously, if he takes the pawn with the knight, knight takes f2, that just loses a piece to Ding Liren's response, bishop takes f2, so that is no good. Instead, here he finds the best move, typical for Magnus Carlsen, knight to g3, trying to hang on in this crazy King's Gambit endgame. But here, Ding Liren, his follow-up, rook a to e8, and now Ding is threatening rook to e1 check in certain lines, with that rook being supported by the other rook on the e8, as well as the pawn on f2. Now here, Magnus Carlsen, bishop c3 is the move, putting pressure on the rook. However, this just further accelerates his demise. The bishop needed to stay on d2, covering this diagonal, because here, when Magnus goes bishop c3, Ding Liren spots the idea of going bishop to g5. That's what he plays in the game, in this King's Gambit endgame. Bishop g5 on the board, hitting the king, and now what should Magnus do? Well, he has two main ideas. One is king b1, getting the king out of the attack, and the other is bishop d2, trying to block. If he went bishop d2, this does not save the game, because here Ding Liren has the incredible shot, rook to e1, and it's essentially a forced checkmate in two moves. Here's why. The main line goes rook takes, then f takes, promoting the pawn to a queen on the e1 square. Then finally rook takes, and that is checkmate, as the bishop on d2 is pinned to the king by Ding Liren's bishop on g5. Now heading back here, after bishop g5, instead Magnus Carlsen played king b1 in this position, trying to get the king out of the attack of the bishop, but this does not help either. Here in this position, Ding Liren plays the move, bishop takes h1, finally winning the rook on h1 in this King's Gambit opening. And here in this position, there is nothing stopping the idea of rook to e1, and Magnus Carlsen is likely to get checkmated on the first rank. Therefore, in this position, on move 23, Magnus Carlsen resigns to Ding Liren in this crazy King's Gambit endgame. Wow, what a game by Magnus Carlsen and Ding Liren in this King's Gambit opening. Alright, Chess YouTube, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please smash the like button. It's the best thing you can do to help me out. Thank you so much for that. And while you're at it, check out my Magnus Carlsen playlist, and I'll see you in the next video.